Javier Rivera. How you doing, Javier
Hey,
Rivera?
what is going on, Daniel?
I tell you what, it is raining and we have weddings, and I hope I don't have a hurricane that floods the wedding this weekend.
Oh
And
yeah,
I'm
that's
trying
right.
to, yeah, that'll be fun. I'm trying, Tyler, good to see you, sir. And I'm trying to, there's a paper from honestly, I started it 10 years ago called The Map is Indestructible Thinking. Alfred Korbowski, Kurt Gödel, Leibniz, Austin Farrer, and Zizek, and all these people together. And how maps function to replace givens sociologically. So I hopefully will get that done without dying. And there was something else, but no, and we've got some other things. But Javier Rivera, how about you? What are you thinking about? Where's your brain, my friend?
Man, I was watching that great interview that you had with Layman Pascal
Oh,
on
yes.
Gurdjieff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and
Well, thank
I
you.
was
Thank you for checking it
yeah,
out.
yeah, it was really good. God, I mean, there's so many things I'm thinking about because I started reading a little bit of the Beelzebub kind of
Mm,
tales from grandson from Gurdjieff.
yeah.
And I watched a couple other interviews with Layman Pascal. Actually, did you see the one where Layman like does this double interview where he's like bouncing with himself? That was great. That was great. And I thought it was such a good interview. And then Layman's own, explaining this, but it really got me thinking about, this idea of automaticity. I think if we explain agency in terms of automaticity, the way people kind of it's really funny because actually the way people seem to take agency as a given, it is kind of automatic. Yeah, it is a kind of automaticity to that. And I just been thinking how, you know, why, and I think I'm really like I really want to get into Gurdjieff now, which is why is the breaking of automaticity the sign of a more inherent agency? And it might have to do, and I think this is what it I think it just changes the definition of agency because it wouldn't be agency isn't what everybody does, but agency is what you strive to do differently, I guess, or more strangely. That seemed to be the theme of you and Layman's talk. This idea of striving to do something differently, something, and that's a really hard thing to do because, and this is why we would need something like practices because how do we know that we're breaking or repeating the sociological structures that we're already embedded in? And I think that's the kind of fundamental question of just like, it's hard to say that you have agency when you're already an agent embedded in the structure from which you say that you are. Um, and some people will be like, well, what do you mean? I have this kind of, I think they take usually like a naive realism, which is like, look, I can drive a car, I can, so on. But the idea of wanting to drive a car is already proof that you're embedded in a social structure of as to why we would want to drive a car. So we're determined in some sense about why we would want to drive a car in the first place or why we would want to learn. It's pretty hard not to. It's pretty hard to go to places without a car these days. you know, so there is definitely a kind of quasi soft determinism, even if we say that I could still choose to not drive a car, you'd still feel the hard repercussions of not learning to drive one. So yeah,
Excellent.
I'll leave it there.
No, excellent. Thomas Jockin, good to see you. Michelle, good to see you. There's a few things that come to mind. First, thank you for listening to that talk with Layman. I always enjoy speaking with him. He's a ton of fun. I think sometimes we basically go, well, if determinism is false, therefore we have agency, when that actually may not follow. It could be the case that determinism is not true, and yet we don't, in a sense, have agency because we haven't cultivated, say, virtue or beauty or thinking agency, right? Like in a funny way, one of the papers we have in Second Thoughts is called Choosing Determinism, which is to say that even if determinism was false, you could still, in essence, act like it was true, or you could act in a manner that actually doesn't exert agency, right? And what is very interesting is from those people like Gurdjieff or many religious or athletic traditions, there's a notion that agency requires some sort of giving yourself over to something that is greater than yourself, which then automatically sounds like you're not free, right? Because if you give yourself over to something, then are you free? Like if you give yourself over to basketball or boxing or family, then there's a way you're not free. And yet there's another way, and that's where it's the only way you have freedom, because it's almost like the name of the game is to choose your determinism, not to just absorb your determinism, right? To choose a determination so that it becomes a necessity, to use language I'll use with Hegel. And Jason, good to see you, sir. Where then it becomes something transformative. And what's very interesting too, and then I'll give it back to you, sometimes I think that what we don't realize is that the feeling of freedom can feel like you lose agency because you lose control. There's a weird thing in which agency can emerge where you don't have control. Well, that sounds like you don't have agency. And I think also what we are seeing is that many of the languages and terms and metaphors that are used to debate the question of agency are inadequate because they're structured in dialectics that are manifest of Newtonian physics and in a scientific worldview. And that becomes the entire framework in which the language is situated. And I think that's very inadequate. And that's something we brought up with Gurdjieff, how you need different metaphorical backgrounds. Jason, good to see you, sir. So I think that's part of the problem as well. But let me give it to you here, Javier.
No, I mean, I was really surprised about how Gurdjieff is already reminding me it's almost like very psychoanalytic. Because he talks about in the beginning, when I started reading the Beelzebub tales, he talks about how the consciousness that we have is not the consciousness that is actually real. The consciousness that we have is the one that is the subconscious, which is already very like psychoanalytic and Freudian. Like that was the whole hard technique of having a relationship with the analyst and the analysand, which was that the analyst had to actually act from his subconscious to the subconscious of the patient. And how do you do that? How do you do that without any type of embeddedness, any type of methodology to do that? And I think that's why Freud is really interesting, because he's trying to say, well, it's not really about a specific methodology. It's about sort of this almost surrendering to one's subconscious, right? Which is really interesting. Now, what's fascinating that you pointed out, Daniel, was that even the idea of we have agency already means that we surrendered ourselves to something. We've already given ourselves to something, which it could be the social embedded situation of the way we think about agency. If agency is the way I pick up this cup or the way I drive a car, then like we don't question that. We don't question, why do I believe that is the sense of agency that it is? And that's an automaticity. That means that you've already given yourself over to a definition, a certain description of agency. Now, what I really like about Gurdjieff already is the fact that if we propose different words, different descriptions, it opens up different worlds, right? We don't need a theory about why there's multiverses, in my opinion, because multiverse itself is the word that opens up the world to different worlds. So I think that's what's really fascinating, is just this idea of a selection of a word already changes our orientation to something. Now, that might have something to do with agency. Can we select our orientation to something? And that might be something similar to what you've been calling choosing determinism, right? We can selectively orient ourselves versus selectively doing in a kind of automatic fashion. So yeah, I mean, I'll stop there.
No, absolutely. I always think, without going into detail on it, I find a very strong argument for freedom in the fact that when someone asks me to go to the movies and I don't want to go, I feel I've lost something. I've lost freedom because I have to say no to them, and maybe they'll be upset with me. Maybe I do. Like, if somebody presents you with something you don't want to do, and you find yourself in those interrelational dynamics, you feel like you lost freedom. You feel like you lost some sort of agency, right? When you are presented with an option you don't want, right? Because the funny thing, if there's something about agency that has this permeating character to it, then it's the moments of the lack that can kind of bring it out or bring it into focus, right? The present absence, something present that is not there. And you feel that when someone asks you to do something you don't want to do, but you know if you say no, they'll be angry. You feel that you've lost something, right? And always find language and conversation too, the conversational act seems to also be a unique testament to this interplay between creativity, cause and effect, determination, and freedom. Because you don't literally think of every word you say before you say it. Otherwise, you'd be a robot trying to talk. There's a way in which you find yourself just speaking, and you find yourself also being presented with words that are not expected. And yet at the same time, the things that come up in your mind are not entirely random either. They are relative to the things that you have put in your stew. So I think conversation, for me, we are too much framing the agency debate in the scientific materialism of Newton. It's not even like, you know, Stuart Kauffman or something. It's more of just Newtonian physics, when really the conversational act as the kind of framework by which to think agency becomes better. And so then it, of course, what does psychoanalysis focus on? And then, of course, many religions are interested in speaking and language. I think language is a big deal. And the other thing with it as well, I definitely think what Gurdjieff is saying on the subconscious, we tend to think of the subconscious, again, from a Newtonian structure as the thing that goes first, and it's like cause and effect. Something appears in your brain, and then it affects what you consciously think. Gurdjieff, and I think this is true, it seems like the subconscious is more like a starter. Michelle's been doing yogurt and the starter sets with yeast. Your subconscious is like a starter set, and your consciousness is what puts things in the starter set, and then stuff comes forth, right? But it's not subconscious to conscious. It's more so consciousness to subconscious and then back, right? And so that's a different ordering. But since we think about the relationship not as a starter set like cooking, because Gurdjieff was big on cooking, right? We think of it as, oh, subconscious goes first, and then you consciously act. Well, of course, there's some sort of framing. There's some sort of the possibility set is relative to the starter, but there's also, you put things in the starter that changes what can come out of it, right? So I think we're stuck in the wrong metaphorical frameworks. Ergo, why I kept, it kept coming up with the Gurdjieff talk, how Gurdjieff's you need to do different practices because they determine the metaphors you use that are not merely decorations of thought, but frame thought. If you only do philosophy and you never dare to do cooking, you're going to be stuck in a framework of thinking and not even know it. So you need to go cook, because then you'll have a better, you need to go dance, you need to go skiing like Phillip, or at the pool, or et cetera, so forth. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, it's good to see you today, sir.
Good to see everybody. But for anyone else down in Florida and the Georgia area, be safe.
Please, absolutely.
we got a mess coming our way later today.
Jeez.
Anyways, very great points. And Javier, I got your messages. I have not gotten back to you. I apologize because I've been in a deep dive at the moment. Actually, funny enough, on the topic of creativity and relevance realization. So this is from the Vervaeke camp. The most recent papers about it have been really interesting about it, because the 2009 papers were saying that basically we think that the presupposition of relevance, you can't work with that. What we can do is we can give a mechanism of relevance realization. So it basically points out that the presupposition of relevance is actually the biggest problem of AI or cognitive science or anything. What is the relevance of a particular context? Generally, even in linguistics, has been deferred to pragmatics. Pragmatics is almost always embedded in this dynamic. It's part of the reason why I believe that Aristotle, who gave us syllogisms, also has rhetoric, has a very specific book on that topic, because he knows that this issue of pragmatics, of relevance realization, cannot be operated on simply by syllogisms. Syllogisms are only instruments of a very narrow domain focus. Okay, but the most recent stuff from Vervaeke's camp, Vervaeke and that company, has been just to posit outright that creativity is not computational. It's very fascinating. I'm very impressed by their willingness to go all in and make the claim. And the justification is to say there is, quite bluntly, organisms have a different mode of intellection. Their mode of operating and working with relevance realization is inherently different from computation. Because always it's the question of what scale of reference does the stimulus get brought in to be referenced, articulated, and responded to, in terms of the current conditions, the current status of the object or the agent, the desired end state, and both the affirmative and the constraints of trajectories of how to get there. Which one? That's on biological. That's just on simple organic elements, let alone versus basically inorganic matter, right? Mechanistic points of view or computational processes. So, and what a really fun, interesting angle about it has been also issues about that improvisation, basically things that are of the spontaneous kind of reaction to unprecedented events or activities that an agent has to respond to, and especially when most interesting when the desired outcome is not known, when an agent does not have an explicit outcome that's predefined, which is what inherently creativity is all about. And Javier, you're asking the question, can AI improv? The problem is it can mimic a preamator mimicry of improv. But see, that's the point. It's always a kind of boundedness of context, of explanation. This is why, you know, one of the explanations of why organisms have a different mode of creativity is because we kind of have, even Aristotle has it, it's poetic nous. It's this the nous has this aspect to it that is, in this sense, one can make an argument is the representation is partly why we are associated with God is because our nous has the power to potentially think of all things. Doesn't actually think of all things. That's the distinction, but it has the potency to do it, of the raw intellect of the nous to do that. So that's basically what the unconscious was kind of drawing to. One way you can read through what's being said with that is that basically there's really fun discussions or debates in the Middle Ages about that. Is there a universal nous that everybody participated? We say collective unconscious, if I had to summarize. That's debated. Some people say yes, some people say no on philosophical accounts about that. The argument would be is that there's some kind of, I'll use my language I was going to use, is paradigms. So from Plato's Parmenides' idea of forms as paradigms are these basically patterns that language and names and analogies give us access to. The same phenomenon presented in different analogies, different frameworks, give you different responses. They set up certain dynamics of the agent's desired endpoint, and it opens up and closes certain trajectories affirmatively and constraints as well. So the operation of the paradigm names we give things is the act of creativity. And Daniel, I'm instantly thinking of our actually a really great example, Daniel, is our discussion about partial objects. Like that original conversation was supposed to be about gratitude, right? And it just became this amazing tour de force of a Lacanian Aristotle slam up together. There's basically, I'm always crediting to you, Daniel, the concept of the partial object. I don't know if you used that before, but it was at that conversation it became, for me, very articulate what you were trying to do with it. And especially on the operation of knowledge as modes of being, right? Which is a very Platonic mode of conversation. Knowledge is not just this kind of abstractional thing of far that a tool we're interacting with. It's an object that affects us directly via the fact that you have to be a certain kind of person to have access to certain knowledge. So that's just a variation of that. And I think in particular, kind of drawing more from Vervaeke's relevant realization, cog science point of view, is the modes of creativity, of exploration and exploitation, right? So there's kind of a divergence mode of thinking, which is why some people have very high interest in schizophrenia and autism as a spectrum of reference, right? In terms of the openness to divergent thinking and protocols versus convergence, which is the kind of narrowing down. Creativity at its best form, especially in the design context, is the unification of both those processes. But you don't get pure divergence, because usually what that doesn't have is basically, it's like hypothetical necessity. From Aristotle, you draw up basically models of how things can be via some end, via a good in some case. So the house is hypothetical and its shelter, but the material necessity of the constraints and the limitations of time, materials, attention, knowledge, all those things are in the convergence process of translating from divergent to convergent. So the diagram is always like a diamond. That's usually the representation of a diamond. Basically, that expands out. And then this is actually, the big issue with AI protocols or tools. Like I've talked about many times in this group about things like style drop, which are basically reproducing how I train design students at the undergrad level how to do design. Of you have a source, you have to map on the source's formal similarities to a new context at different levels of intensity of complexity of how much conversion has to be done. But that's the basic process for a lot of junior designers. That's very good so AI is very good at that divergent thinking protocol. It's very good at that. It's very good if you have a reference model to have it reproduce it and give you options from that. That's all divergent thinking protocols. That's fantastic. It's very useful for that. But the problem with AI is generally it's convergence power, which we talked about in the last net session together, of the set of options, why pick this option, not the others? And especially now AI can do it if you give it a predefined, explicit end goal. You give it parameters of assessment. But the problem is with creativity or anything in this domain is they usually work with vague, incomplete, and uncertain prerogatives on one of the 4 categories of basically active inference models of the state of the agent, the desired end state, and the trajectories of either affirmatively or constraints. Those are usually uncertain. So as a result, as long as you have those, an AI can do it. But the problem with creativity is that it doesn't. Thus, it can give you a mimicry of basically of anything with AI. It can do that. No one's saying that. But the definition of creativity, especially in the context of surprise, because that's one of the most important things we found was that surprise as a kind of objective measure of beauty that has epistemology value, epistemic value, as well as sensual, basically arousal at the same time. That property requires basically prediction error from a model. But the problem is which ones are actually valid or useful prediction errors that spike creativity, that spike curiosity, and especially when it's uncertain, that kind of instinct of an individual to go, I'm curious about this. I want to keep pursuant of this trajectory of where this takes me. That's relevant realization, especially under conditions of opacity of one of the 4 variables in play, as said before. So I find that very interesting, and this is where the issues of unconscious plays in, and subjectivity, especially of a subject and of partial objects, and how we orient ourselves to things results in how we interact with it. But anyways, that's what I'm reading about right now, and that's what I got.
No, outstanding. I'll give it to Javier. Well, Elizabeth, first, that was a tremendous conversation. I enjoyed it immensely, and the connection of partial objects with beauty, etc. I think also like a way, I do, to the Gurdjieff point, it is funny how in calling AI artificial intelligence, that metaphorically sets you up to ask the question, is it human intelligence? But imagine if it was called EI, extending intelligence, or MI, mechanical, or CI, computer intelligence. It's funny how maybe there wouldn't even be debates on can it replace human beings. But because it's called artificial intelligence and the word intelligence is there, then it's like, oh, it's something that can do what human beings could do. But one could imagine it being called something else, and it may actually be different. Maybe you just called it Panda. What if we called it Panda? Will we debate if Panda could replace human beings? We may not. It's quite clear that ChatGPT, let me tell you, I used to have to do all these terrible scheduling things on the website for the venue, and it used to take like hours, and I can say, an HTML code, bam, oh my gosh, oh my freaking gosh. So it's just like Jason was just saying, well, but yeah, it's pretty grand. The thing is that, like we were saying last week, if you get in a birdie and donkey situation with 2 equally piles of grains and both are equally rational to eat, how would AI determine what to do? Because that would be a non-rational choice. It may end up in a Nash equilibrium, the donkey die in the middle, right? Like it would be equally rational for AI to just kind of be in the smallest of all possible little dust balls to save as much energy as it can and make for itself a Huxley pleasure machine versus conquer the universe. Right? Like why is conquering the universe the most rational thing to do versus just make a really small dust ball, like the Great Divorce Hell kind of thing that AI lives in, right? What's the difference? They seem to be equally piled with brains. We as human beings, because we may value taking over the universe more so than a little small dust ball, we say, that's what AI is going to do. But AI might, unless we program it otherwise, just generate a little dust ball for itself. Because why shouldn't using the least amount of energy be the number one value, right? You know, you could use the least number of energy by just being as small as possible, right? And if you can simulate pleasure, why not that, right? So there's a constraint question there. The other thing that's very interesting, like with the question of creativity being primary, is Vervaeke, and I know that Matt Segal was talking about some of that as well. There's an interesting question of why is it that the burden of proof rests on those who want to assert that creativity is fundamental versus something like causation, or why is it the burden of proof rests on people of whom want to argue that there is something that is ultimately non-computable at the basis of reality, right? Because the funny thing about it is our lived experience, I'm not trying to make a scapegoat of science or anything, or a whipping boy, but there's a real emphasis in science on observation and empiricism and lived experience, right? Well, constantly, every single moment, it seems like there's a free will. It seems like there's some sort of interrelationship between things you control and things you don't control, and a kind of interplay between those things, right? Like, I don't know of anyone in history who argued for something like agency, and I know we're conflating the terms, but if you grant it, like, I don't know of anyone who argued for free will and by that meant total will, meaning you could literally do anything you ever wanted to do. Free will simply meant some degree of influence over what is within the parameters of the given, right? Well, that seems to be what you experience, right? Regularly, constantly. Now you could say, but it's not in a scientific experiment, like a science method. Okay, granted, but I would also say that it's a bit of a rumor to say that is fundamental, like that science is just fundamentally that, especially once you look at a poll, Feyerabend and against method, like Galileo is certainly not following the modern paradigm. We've conflated the scientific consensus that defines academia with science in the history of science when it's not so simple. But really, we're constantly observing some sort of interplay between things we control and don't. So why isn't that the burden of proof really rests on, say, those who want to argue we don't have free will, right? Well, it's because we're basically still in a scientific metaphor. We're still in the Newtonian paradigm, right? And we have this idea that there's a big bang, and then there's a cause and effect, and that's why we're here, right? So we're like, well, because of the origin of the universe, our idea of how the universe was created and how cause and effect works then shifts the burden of proof. The reason I say all this, though, is because if Stuart Kauffman, who I am convinced is putting forth one of the most compelling explanations of cosmology I have ever seen, who really needs to enter the discussion, because, they just had that experiment like 2 weeks ago that basically shows quantum loop ain't going to work, right? Like, they really, like, quantum loop theories are basically in huge trouble. I'd have to go into detail of that, but then that leaves us with string theory. And I don't know about y'all, but that seems like it's in huge trouble as well. So what are we going to do, right? Well, Stuart Kauffman says, what if non-locality is fundamental? Ladies and gentlemen, if non-locality is fundamental, then the burden of proof rests on determinism, not freedom, because suddenly top-down causality is real. And if two particles can interact with one another without interacting, that's non-locality. Locality means there can be a signal within the speed of light. If two particles, like in quantum mechanics, and we have closed the loophole on that in Nobel, the Nobel Prize went to the one who closed the loophole. Okay, so non-locality exists. If non-locality exists, and it's fundamental, and thus there is automatically a top-down causality that creates a quantum vacuum out of which you get the construction of the universe without collapsing into a loophole, well, then there is top-down causation. And that means you cannot say the universe is simply one darn thing following the next. Things come into existence, and the things that exist then retrospectively work on their parts to change the entire system into an unpredictable structure. Well, then the burden of proof would rest on the people who want to argue creativity is not fundamental, or that things like that are not computable, like suddenly everything would shift, right? Like the basically axiomatic assertion that creativity is non-computable, which seems like dogmatic and rigid, and, oh, you can't just say that, where's your proof? Well, suddenly it flips, because the whole reason you have that orientation is from the absorbing of a scientific paradigm that overemphasizes causation and assumes that locality is fundamental. That's the key. If you assume that locality is fundamental, therefore there has to be things touching per se in order to influence one another, well then yeah, cause and effect, things touch, bounce, billiard balls, so on and so forth. But if non-locality is fundamental, meaning things can have influence over one another without it necessarily simply being in a causational calculus, well, then determinism is not determinism. It is a interplaying. It's like events and processes or dewdrops, like in Whitehead, right? Like, because the Vervaeke, like that stress on creativity would be Whiteheadian. You could even put it with the absolute idealism of Hegel and other things, right? So I think that's very important to note, is that where we as a people set the burden of proof is relative. Well, this is funny, right? Like, this is where your belief of how the universe was started impacts like where your burden of proof rests, right? Like, who knew that origin affects like where burden of proof rests? But it does. And I think the free will question kind of agency shows that. But I was just thinking that. Let me give it to Javier here. Mr. Javier Rivera, please.
I mean, this, in other words, like the example of like Astro Boy or something. You know, the fact that the scientific paradigm has been obsessed with agency or technological agency has already been talked about in scientific fiction, right? It's been a part of this conversation. Yeah, Astro Boy is in the anime. Yeah, correct. Correct. Yeah, because it's the perfect example of an AI already having some agency that believes he's a real boy. He believes he's a real boy. So it's kind of like a play on was it Pinocchio almost? And what's super fascinating is like I think in a psychoanalytic point of view, there's something about this scientific fantasy that is found in scientific fiction that is always depicting the end of the world via AI. um, and it's funny that the Japanese have also been like the ones that are most adamant about AI, ironically. They've already been constructing robots to take care of their old people. If you guys look up YouTube videos, they've been constructing AI spiritual kind of camps where there's like an AI Buddha or whatever. If you can like look that up. But this was like all stuff that I was shown in like my like anime classes and like Buddhist classes that I took. But what's really fascinating is that in a Freudian take, there must be some bizarre wish that something takes over our agency. Right? That there's something. This is what's interesting. Okay, this is like what's super interesting is that AI is this thing what we're consciously afraid of that could eliminate us, that could take away our agency. And yet I feel like it's the same religious, you could say maybe the religious gripe of, I don't want to surrender myself to something. And it seems like the impasse is, well, you're going to have to surrender yourself to something. The question is, what is it that you want to give yourself over to? And when the limited imagination is either we remain as we are or give ourselves to robots, people don't really like that. But then I also really question when we say that we don't really like that, why do we keep improving this technology? Why do we keep, advancing it? Why isn't there a sudden stop in its development to show that we're not interested in what it could become? But it seems that other people, maybe not all of us, are very interested in what it could become. And yet the people that are interested in what it could become, like Elon Musk, they're also very concerned about the dangers of it, which is also really interesting. So I mean, just going back to like Jockin's idea of this idea that creativity isn't computational, and I agree with him that so far AI can only take borrowed models and imitate them. And that's kind of the restriction. So basically it almost saying like AI doesn't have a history until we put it there. AI doesn't have a reference model until we put it there. And it's funny because in some sense, like we need a history, we need reference models to do our creative things. But what's really interesting is I actually think the discrepancy between suboptimal positions between a human being and an AI. What would be the suboptimal position for an AI in terms of like telling them to create something? it would be like, actually, I don't know, but all I'm saying is like the suboptimal position seems different from human beings to an AI, primarily because for me, it takes effort to do something that the AI already expediently does. And the question is, when we do the suboptimal effort, when I have to draw by hand what I want to do, in that suboptimal effort, I can change my mind in the moment of that suboptimal effort. I can go, oh, this is about to be a star. Maybe I can change into something else. Or maybe, like, this is what's interesting about using like free drawing or enacting on the unconscious to kind of free write or free draw, is that you're not preemptively using a self-reference, but actually you're fluctuating the self-reference models so often that it can change into anything it could be, precisely because you're in a suboptimal position to allow fluctuation of referent models to go from. But the AI, because it's so fast, its suboptimal position is actually just picking or selectively picking the quickest reference model, perhaps, and then just reproducing it. So in some sense, is there a suboptimal position other than its expediency? Well, I don't even know if that's expediency would be. Well, I guess the expediency would be the avoidance of the suboptimal position, right? I don't know what the suboptimal position would be other than its dependency on a reference model and not slowing itself down to entertain other self-reference models. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, I'll give it to Phillip here. Well, there's a bunch of things that come to mind. First off, there's a kind of idea that there's one way in which AI can only exist if humans come into existence. So even if AI are superior to human beings, that's thanks to human beings, which then is interesting because then in a way, are they superior to human beings if they require, because you also, like Benita Roy will stress, humans are not in the cosmos or in nature. They are nature and are the cosmos, right? So what that means is that, and this is Whiteheadian, is that nature continues in human beings. And I think this is also very important because, and actually Charles Einstein in his book Sacred Economics, he talks about this point. Often we assume that if human beings destroy the environment, and if you removed human beings, the environment would thrive. Well, actually, there are lots of examples where when humans go away, the environment's worse off. That humans can do things to the environment to accelerate its healing and its thriving that nature cannot do on its own. Now, at the same time, we can also destroy things, right? Because, so for example, if humpback whales and coyotes and different animals, if it's actually the case that they have incredibly important functions for the thriving of the environment, like the movement of CO2, like whales do stuff in the ocean, like all these different animals do very important things. So if you get rid of coyotes, it actually has unintentional consequences. Like he kind of talks in a kind of Gaian sense, but it's not so crazy. He just wants to say that, not that I'm saying the Gaia stuff is crazy for anyone out there who has a Gaia necklace, don't let me stop you. I like Final Fantasy 2 as well. But it's kind of the keystone. There you go. It's this idea that it's a living system. So if you remove one thing, it has unintentional consequence. The Earth is a living system. Well, humans are part of that living system, not what kills it. We have a certain role in it. And there are various like Australian Aborigine thing that says humans shepherd nature, right? That they have some role to shepherd it. And if you remove them, it destroys the whole thing. The $1 million question is, if you create AI, would AI look at us and say, hey, they're just like we look at the whales and say, if we get rid of the whales, the Earth's going to fall apart? Would AI look at us and say, man, if we get rid of the humans, like the Earth's going to fall apart, actually? Because they have a function that keeps the environment going that AI cannot do. Thus, even if they have some superiority to us, we're not replaceable. Like, again, if humpback whales literally seem to have some function following Einstein, that if they die, we're in huge trouble. In what sense are humans superior to humpback whales, right? Like, we literally can't do what these whales can do, right? If they die, we die, or the Earth is in huge trouble, right? Or coyotes. Like, he makes examples of coyotes. So wait. If coyotes die, the human race is in trouble? There's a weird thing there where you say humans, like, there's a way in which the language of superior or unsuperior doesn't make sense if it's a interconnected unfolding that needs all of the other parts, right? So there is a question on, is there something that human beings can do, and it probably has something to do with the body, the fact that we have a body and can receive qualia information that might be unique for humans, at least for a long period of time, that if AI gets rid of us, it loses a source of information that it needs in order for itself to thrive and for everyone to thrive. Because one could imagine a world like what Charles is saying, and then I'll give it to Phillip here, is that basically if humpback whales thrive, we thrive. And if we thrive, they thrive, actually, because it needs it all, right? It's just if you rightly order the relationship, right? And so it could easily be the same thing with AI. AI cannot thrive unless we thrive, and we can't thrive unless AI thrive, right? But here's the trick. That's all relative to the ordering of the relationship. And what exactly is suboptimal? Oh, so what Charles says is, yeah, we basically have to decide. He talks about a world of concrete and excrement. If we continue down this path, the world will basically suck. It will be concrete. It will not have vibrancy. There will be low air pollution. We may have a lot of GDP, but we might not have a lot of beauty or the environment, right? Do you want that world? Keep killing the humpback whales, you can have that world, right? But what's funny is humans won't die, right? I mean, we'll still be alive in our concrete and excrement world with bad air pollution until we nuke each other. So is it suboptimal? Why or why not, right? And so you could also say, well, maybe AI has to make its own absolute choice. It's like, well, we don't really need qualia data inputs. We're just fine to be the zombies in the Chomper sense. We don't have qualia, but we can do everything humans can do just without experience. And we don't really care about that additional qualia information that the human body can provide. Well, maybe it ends up in the equivalent of concrete and excrement that Charles says for itself, right? Does it want that? Does it not? How would it make the absolute choice? Maybe it can't make the absolute choice without human beings because we are uniquely positioned to help with Nash equilibria situations, uniquely positioned to help with absolute choices, right? So I think what's this is my, and then I'll pass it to Phillip. If indeed creativity is somehow fundamental, then the future is open and it is abyssal. So there's a weird sense in which the language of suboptimal is always relative and conditioned by the one asking the question. You simply have to ask what kind of future you want. And it's completely abyssal. Is it better? Is it worse? By what standard? Well, this is where something like beauty is a big deal, because beauty seems to be the possibility of breaking through subjectivity to suggest something of authority. And if your world does not create the conditions of possibility for the strike of beauty to come forth, it is on the basis of the lack of that experience that you could say that it is suboptimal. So this is where the character of beauty becomes very, very interesting, but it becomes interesting precisely because it's mysterious. And what does it seem like you can't do? Compute it. So beauty seems to be a testament to the very creativity that is fundamental, and its authority comes from sort of participation in that thing that is fundamental, right? And so that might be a direction to go in on the question of the suboptimal or the optimal. But of course, beauty is very hard to think. And again, AI might be able to function in a, what's the word, the aberration? I think custodial. He says humans are custodians of nature. Well, maybe AI can be custodians of humans and we custodians of it. And it creates an overall structure that might be able to increase the possibility of the experience of beauty. But I do think it is interesting to think of it all as a continuum that is all working together in a kind of custodial structure for something that if you remove one part, the rest dies. So maybe we'll be like the humpback whales for the AI. And if they kill us, some unintentional consequence occurs in the same way that humpback whales apparently matter falling short. But let me give it to Phillip. Phillip, you are so beautiful. It's good to see you, my friend.
Divine, Daniel. You are a vibe, a vision, a vicar of virtue. And you're almost completely wrong about this. The only thing that is not the only thing, but one of the things I would change the name to production intelligence. And I will say that it's already influencing our worlds a lot more than is not just like completely anxiety producing, Aladdin, right? We started in like what, 1988, has something like 88 billion that's under management. They're now at like 9.1 trillion. India has something like 3.1. What a lot of people think is beautiful, right? The growth of GDP. And their ability for impactful action is asymmetrical to just about anyone else's. They have the ability to enact change that like writing a philosophy book doesn't have at the moment. So I think like this is one of the, yeah, obviously like now still humans are exploitable, right? So we're still exploitable. There will probably come a time where we're no longer, I mean, we're already becoming less and less exploitable. I think that's the question. Then what? And to think that it's going to be run like democratically, I don't know, maybe. I don't want to be like a huge black-pilled presence, but a part of me thinks that because there's almost nothing we can do, that actually creative possibilities open from that kind of acknowledgement. We can free ourselves up to create new values and affirm new ways of being. And the best place I can think, like I was reading Javier, I was reading your piece on curiosity. For such a long time, I feel like we've put a lot of consciousness towards the individual has had to focus a lot on their self-perpetuation and not so much on their expansion in realms where, like, you know, beyond the limit of the body, you can actually get to the nous, the creative overmind, whatever. And so I wonder, like, spending time there, would you be a more pleasant human being? I don't know, if you can sit in a full lotus for 4 hours while still like being a wage earner in the attention economy, that can create some kind of new artwork because they have trained the physical, the mental, and the emotional energies in such a way that Gurdjieff prescribes. That is like, until you can harness these, kind of a Nietzschean will to power, part of you able to command, the other part obeying, you won't have the capacity to think the new. Once you've done that, probably no one's going to understand you. They'll probably just be like, what? What are you talking about? But yeah, I think that's like sort of the difference between, someone who wants to be like a prophet who pokes a hole in their own system versus a worldview salesman.
Oh, no, very fair. And I should clarify, we are obviously killing a whole lot of humpback whales, and the probability is that we will continue to do so. Like, in the same way that the likelihood of AI simply being used to, exploit and destroy is far higher than some sort of symbiotic relationship between the two. The thing that I would like to consider is AI innately bad? Or are there ways to see it as part of an environment with a stewardship structure? In the same way, I resist saying humans are innately bad to nature, right? That seems to have gotten us in trouble. It's like, no, there is plenty of evidence to show that humans can actually improve nature in certain areas when they have the right mindset, and actually removing humans off the land destroy the topsoil. You say, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, actually, you can't just assume removing humans is good for nature, right? Because if that doesn't apply for humpback whales, why would it apply for humans, right? Likewise, it may be the case that AI could help us thrive, that removing AI doesn't mean that humans are better off. There could be a stewardship relationship, even if that is unlikely. Because in all likelihood, human beings tend to destroy the environment versus do this kind of stewardship role. But the question is the necessity, right? And in fact, Maybe agency is its most powerful and pronounced where it's unlikely, where it is unlikely that it emerges. I also do think history is a story where you don't see significant change until disaster, until like the historical forcing function. Like we've talked before about how I see the liminal web or this technology as potentially a social coordination mechanism. You like the pricing mechanism for the possibility of creating social engagement and actually our own top-down causations based on the social fetishes, as Zizek talks, and that we make that can actually work on us, that are not simply absorbed from the economy, but actually intentionally created by our own willingness to participate in them, right? But I'm also not a fool to know that that is very unlikely for the majority of people to do, especially before some sort of crisis that would push people in that direction. And then the question is simply, do you survive the crisis or not? Is it nuclear or not, right?
Well,
please.
And then I think it's like once you have survived the crisis, it's like it blows my mind that Tolkien died in like the 70s. I like for some reason think that dude was around in like the 1500s, but it's almost as if like he was writing for the industrial age. It's almost as if some kind of new myth comes out of the digital age, with all these different archetypes that are sort of just like waiting for ways to give people direction when the new paradigm emerges.
No, I mean, there's arguments to be said that, you know, you get these, what is it, the Renaissance with the Black Plague. I mean, there are these big cultural movements that occur after devastations, right? Like you see now, so there is some sort of interesting dimension that when everything hits the fan, you look in the mirror and say, wow, do we want to do that again? But then, of course, the problem is you can forget it. And this is where they say, you know, are you on a swing? Because that's freaking romantic. Kiss me down by the water. Da, da. Oh, that's really good. So there is this idea. But you see, I do think we cannot assume that something bad happening, that is so great. Something bad happening means people will change. This is where I do think there's something to be said about doing the work before the bad to be ready for the catching. Like if there's no tilling of the ground, if the bad is the throwing of the seeds are just going to hit hard rock and not grow, actually. I do think there's something about preparing for the conditions of possibility, use that sexy Kantian phrase, so that if the bad thing forces people, there are people there to catch things, right? I think of the monastery tradition where there are monasteries on the Silk Road, fall of the Roman Empire, to receive people if they're looking for alternatives. There are communities people can go, but all those, and this is something that the sociologists talk about, but all those places can do is engage in the faithful presence, as Hunter calls it, the work to receive those of whom are open to the alternative ways of doing things, precisely because of the devastation that is happening that makes them open to it, right? And look, that seems to be analogous with human lives. Human beings don't tend to exercise until the doctor says, hey, if you don't exercise, you will die. Or something bad happens in the marriage and they go, you know, I got to stop being an a-hole, right? There's something about human beings that the greater the scale, the greater the unlikelihood there will be change before devastation. It's not impossible, but if we're talking numbers, then in the majority of cases, it tends to be the case that you don't have paradigmatic shifts or significant shifts until something bad happens. That seems to be a relative constant at scale through history, right? But the question is, I do think, though, and this is where agency, I think, comes in, I do think the effectiveness of the change that people are open to after the devastation is relative to the work that was done before the bad thing to prepare for there to be a space for people to enter into or to see alternatives. If that work was not done before the devastation, then people would be open to change, but there would be nothing there they'd see to change to. There'd be no models, as Jockin stresses. There'd be no ideas to shift to. So they'd be like, yeah, that didn't work, but there's no alternative, so let's just try it again. You know, we say the ones who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. I think it's more so like, even if you learn from history, if there's no alternatives on offer, you have to repeat it, right? So it's really important for people to do the work ahead of time to be modeling alternatives. So when people are open to change, they can see the thing to change into. And that's kind of the interplay where agency emerges, actually. Like agency is not merely the It's in the lack of guarantee. Like you're doing work to till the ground for a possibility that you don't know for sure will occur, but nevertheless you choose to. And that is confirmed as the seeds are thrown because of the bad thing. And the agency emerges in the whole dynamic of the choice of faithful presence, the staying steadfast during the hard time, and then being ready to receive as people are open to those possibilities. I think agency in that sense comes out more of a continuum of an interaction between the individual, the historic moment, the social, the openness, and the preparedness, as opposed to do you get vanilla ice cream or chocolate, right? And I think ultimately agency does have a social dimension, but it's tied to the social imagination, to use that sociological phrase, we choose to try to enact, that we give ourselves over to so that other people can be part of it when they are so open to it. But those are some thoughts, but let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, this idea like that Philip was kind of posing with like, what if we sort of, what if people started cultivating like, like a 6-hour lotus to kind of gather a creative energy. I mean, the idea with like Gurdjieff and like Nietzsche is is that there seems to be a very particular nature to these people. And even like Gurdjieff's initial story in the Beelzebub Tales, and I actually really like this story. It's the one where there's a trans Caucasian Kurd who decides to buy fruits from the store. And as he's eating the fruits, his whole body is like burning. And Gurdjieff uses this little anecdote, little story as an example of saying that, there's a man that comes up to him and is like, "Why are you eating the fruit still?" He's like, "Well, because I bought it." And it's this example of that you shouldn't do things or continue to do things if they're not according to your nature. So that's the slight complication with the Gurdjieff thing, is that one, how do we do things according to our nature? And then there's another thing where I think Lehman kind of extrapolated more on the Gurdjieff example, which was I think some people are just going to be automatons, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah, he actually said that. He's like, there's nothing wrong with being an automaton. It's kind of just like how the life goes. If everything's connected, it's possible that we need certain people to be automatons. But the thing is, do we need everyone to be an automaton? Is that the question? Do we need everyone to be a kind of, acquiring a certain amount of agency and doing something? It seems that if we're taking the argument that Daniel's posing seriously, everything is connected to everything else, then there is real cost to provoking everyone to sit down and do like a lotus position or engage in certain various techniques to. And I would say if we already entertain the idea of various techniques and want to engage in that, I would say it's because it's already an interest to our nature for it. We're already interested in this. We're already curious about it. Now what's interesting about that is, should we not talk about it and not, you could say, maybe preach about it? Because the issue is there might be people that are, you could say, being stuck in their automaticity that could wake themselves out of that automaticity. So it's like very hard to say and determine who are the people that will remain in their automaticity and who are the people that won't. So we're at this question again of, we probably should still, and we should probably still provoke the idea to people, because it could awake something that they already inclined to, but they just didn't know about it. Or that they were already searching for something, but they didn't know what they were searching for. So this question of nature, this question of of what it is, it seems like we need both. We need people that are not interested in it, that the curiosity might stop there. But of course, the question is always, are those the people that wish for their curiosity to stop there? And that's the kind of dilemma that I think we're in, which is, is not to say that everything should be a prescription, but it's to say that there's certain descriptions that could be a prescription for people if they just knew what the description was. What are the descriptions missing that could provoke my life? And I think that's that was kind of like my initial obsession with this idea of curiosity, is that initially we want our curiosity to stop, which is kind of ironic thing because curiosity almost kind of goes in line with death drive. But yeah, this question of relation, this question of how do we you know, and the thing with like Nietzsche, for example, which I always found interesting, was like there's like a Nietzsche that I took seriously, and then there's like a Nietzsche that I had to like be like, this is his will to power. Which is like actually very hard to discern, because like there's the Nietzsche that's providing you the concept of the will to power. Then there's the Nietzsche that is saying all these things that is ironically the product of his will to power. And I feel like those are like very hard to discern when we're like reading people like Nietzsche, because like the will to power is just more like this ambiguous framing that Nietzsche is giving an example of himself as a will to power. At least that's how I read him. I read him as he's using his own, he's making himself an own example of his own concept. And so it's like a double fold, it's like a double folded on itself. And so it's this hard delineation, and this is why it's like to be a follower of Nietzsche is to not be a follower of Nietzsche. That's his kind of double move. Right? Like you're not supposed to actually follow him. You're supposed to not follow him because that's the will to power. So it's already provoking you. What is, according to your nature, that one should entertain and provoke? Or let's say the way Adam Phillips put it, because of Stuart Mill, experiments in living. Why don't we experiments in living, you know? Well, yeah, you're right. I don't think he explicitly said don't follow him, but in the metaphor of Zarathustra, there is definitely this kind of antagonism with wanting to be a loyal disciple of him. But yeah, I'll stop there.
No, magnificent. So there's a few things that come to mind. I'll give it to Jockin and Phillip. And I will warn everyone, because I have to set up chairs for the wedding this weekend before it rains. I will, in like 45 or so minutes, have to go at the point where Michelle will come up and pull me out of the room. So do be warned, because work is a tyrant. So there's a few things. First off, one of the things that religions did that we haven't learned how to do that was actually really important is they said, hey, the least will be first. Oh, you see that poor guy over there? Could be an angel. Oh, the barista who never studied philosophy, they could be holier than you. Like adding a certain question mark over who's best, right? And also to see it all, this is the great, honestly, the great innovation of Martin Luther was to tear down the distinction between the magistrate and the layman. And, you know, the great example I always use is he said, hey, in the Lord's Prayer, if you say, you know, give us our day, our daily bread, you are saying that God uses the bread maker, not just the priest. So suddenly the bread maker who never read philosophy can be the hand of God. So don't be so quick to assume, right? That is something we really struggle to seriously think in a world of market forces where some people are paid more than others. And what other standard of value is there? We all know money doesn't buy happiness and isn't the ultimate thing. But I sometimes wonder if that just functions to preserve the ideology, because we practically act that way when we know better, which then makes us think we're above it as we do it. So that distinction, like without that kind of religious thrust, the knowledge that money isn't everything actually can kind of have an ideological function to practically make money everything as we all disavow it and disown it, right? So the distinction between the technical and the practical is one of the great tools that ideology uses to trick us and to contribute to self-deception. So I do wonder about that. And, you know, there's a few other things. There are a lot of people who do construction that are probably, that are way stronger than most philosophers, like 90% of them, right? They are more physically fit. And Nietzsche's all the time talking about physical fit, the body dancing. There's a whole lot of people that have nothing to do with philosopher that are stronger than the majority of philosophers in that way, even if philosophers are maybe stronger in the intellectual way, right? So there's also a problem where when Nietzsche talks about strength or will to power, it's kind of broken up, right? There is a, like, it's like in a college educated world where that makes you the most money. And of course we experience intelligence as superior because we are self-selected as people who do that kind of thing. It's hard not to index that as the primarily way to think of strength. But Nietzsche would also say, well, the construction worker is actually stronger in this other way, right? So then the question becomes, for me, this is where Gurdjieff can actually help with Nietzsche in that sense, because instead, like the Philip put the very good quote on, like the strong need to be safe from the weak. The strong, almost, I think, a better way to think about it, and I don't actually think Nietzsche would disagree with it based on book 5 of the Gay Science. The strong are those of whom do not avoid discomfort, and the weak are those who avoid discomfort. And it's so strong means you go into what makes you discomfortable. That's what Gurdjieff is all about. He's like, hey, man, you don't have spiritual advancement if you're avoiding comfort. Well, for the construction worker, that may look like reading Hegel. For the Hegelian scholar, that may look like doing construction work. And the stronger those who do that interconnection, that do the bothness, that move into the discomfort, right? And definitely in Nietzsche, there's an emphasis on the discomfort because human nature is to moralize weakness and comfort and to actually make it okay to avoid discomfort, right? And so it's so difficult. Like literally, if you're reading philosophy, you are very often made to feel like the society, unless you're getting paid for it, that you're a fool, right? Like that you're a fool, right? And so there's a certain discomfort you have to face to do it. But then there can come a point where you've read philosophy or been doing it for a long time, where actually there's now a comfort in doing it, right? And suddenly can emerge the need for the discomfort where you take up gardening or dancing, right? But this is where Gurdjieff, like Lehman was saying, it's so individuated because it shifts at, for me, it's 37. For someone else, it's 42. Someone else, it's 22. And you have to have the individual relationship and judge it and then say, hey, you need to take up dancing. You need to take up Hegel. You need to take up philosophy. Oh, you need to get married. That customization, it seems like there's no logic, but it's what the spiritual teacher is gauging is the area of discomfort you can go into, that you can handle, that you need to break you out of whatever the source of comfort is. Like there's a point where curiosity becomes a source of comfort because you know what to do today. Follow my curiosity. I know what to do, right? So it ceases to be discomfort. But that liveness is what's so hard, right? Because there's also an issue where if you go, well, I'm just going to do what's discomfortable and then I'll be in the right. Maybe not, because then you're comfortable with just doing the thing that's hard, right? Maybe actually the hardest thing is to do something that's easier. And if when you read through the history of like this is a constant stress in many religions, right? Like Martha's like, why doesn't Mary get up and help? Because he's actually doing the better thing right now, right? But then there are other times where there's a problem, right? And I think that individuation is what makes this so tricky. And yet that also seems to be the development of agency. The very fact that it's so individuated and yet simultaneously universal in the prescription suggests a kind of singularity of agency, but also a universality in the process of agency. So those things came to mind. But because then the question becomes, the last thing I'll say, what is the thing that needs to be universalized regardless the person, right? Is it philosophy? Is it athletic prowess? Is it business skills? Because that's always the thing. Like when you read Nietzsche, like, oh, so everyone needs to do philosophy or the Lotus Pit. Well, what is the thing, like the essential thing you want to scale or spread, right? Philosophy seems to have something to do with it, but doesn't necessarily seem to be it in its entirety, right? Like if I were to say, like if I say, just notice the difference of how this hits. If I say everyone needs to do philosophy, that sounds awful. You know, how you're being very, self-important or arrogant or universalist. But if I were to say everyone needs to have courage, oh, well, that doesn't sound so, that actually sounds proper, right? If I say everyone needs to do, wrestling, well, that doesn't sound very good. But if I say that everyone needs to needs to do things that make them uncomfortable, well, that sounds okay, right? In fact, that sounds correct. So there's also a question on what is the thing that needs to be spread. And it could be the case that without philosophy, you can't actually develop intellectual courage, right? But that would mean philosophy is needed for the courage, not as the thing in itself, right? Likewise, if you say everyone needs beauty, okay, yeah, that sounds correct. That sounds different from saying, everyone needs philosophy. But then what's tricky is it seems like there's something about philosophy necessary for courage and beauty. which then makes it seem like everyone needs philosophy, but it depends on what you mean. You need something like it, right? Likewise, if I say everyone needs virtue, well, that sounds proper. But then if I say everyone needs to be a good worker at the factory, well, wait, why that virtue, right? So that's where I think it gets tricky, is that kind of navigation of the details. But again, that seems to go to the Gurdjieff kind of customization. But let me give it to Jockin, Phillip, and then Jason. Mr. Jockin.
Well, yeah, this is exactly on the point of relevance realization, because that's the point. We have this kind of concept, this notion, virtue, beauty, but then the particularity of it is contingent on which scale reference we're talking about and what things we're picking out from it. And by the way, I'm making a big note is the idea of the doctor of the soul, right? This is from Phaedrus, from that Plato dialogue, of the kind of rhetoric of the rhetorician who's shaping the soul of a subject. And this is pulling from the Equitable from Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics. A good trainer knows that he doesn't prescribe the exact mean to everybody. Doesn't make any sense, because a beginner, intermediate needs different things. And more importantly, on more the temperaments of personality, some people are more brash, right? Others are more cowards. The prescription to get them to the mean is different. And the amount and the intensity at what time and all these variables are incredibly particularized. So I see a lot of harmonization between Plato and Aristotle on that part. I think especially the whole point too, by the way, like the biggest point, that the beauty, kalos, right, basically the fine, in this case, it looks useless for people who can't participate with it. So that's always the trick about it, is that it appears useless. And in fact, Aristotle makes that really explicit in Eudaimonia Ethics at the very end. He says, if you do courage or wisdom or any of the prudence, or any of the virtues, for any good that comes out of it, like as a means to an end, you didn't do virtue properly. You got anything that came out of it was accidental. It wasn't intentional to you. It wasn't attributable to you. The real absolute stance is it's good for its own sake. This is also, by the way, related to money, like, our relationship with money. I think it's very important to realize that we're stuck, when we talk about being stuck in local minimums that get us trapped into loops where we cannot get ourselves out of sometimes. Our relationship to money is a very clear part about this. Money, especially interest-bearing assets, we are completely antithetical to all classic traditional points of view about this. Aristotle was incredibly pessimistic about it. The merchant class, especially the money exchangers, were the most notorious of the group because they didn't do actual work. That was the argument. They're not doing activity of any real sense. This was part up all the way through. It's still in the Islamic tradition. Islam still does not allow interest-bearing assets. Christianity also had that stance for a very long time as well. Usury laws, for example. So just like kind of our relationship to zero and infinity as concepts, like as someone who studies Aristotle, Plato, I have to know what are the significant difference of paradigms that if you don't realize you're going into reading them, that are so diametrically apart that you're going to misunderstand what's happening here. Those are two major parts right there. Another big one is actually, a kind of presupposition of the absolute goodness of democracy. Trust me, Plato and Aristotle did not have that position. Anyone who reads them knows that's not their call. That's not their take on things. They actually generally say it's one of the worst forms. It's like, okay, gets the job done, but it's not really that good compared to other modes of law, of governance. We have a very different point of view about that. And especially related to kind of what Javier was bringing up, this idea of the more colloquial term now is the NPC. The NPC is making the presumption, the non-playable character is making the presumption that certain people get to actually cognize in reality. Other people are just operating on programs where they're not meant to actually think. They're meant to just operate on the program. And society has to work on that assumption, right? The kind of the NPC meme joke is to play off that. And that's both in our mercantile experience, in terms of interaction with each other, and our social political context. That the political, which is, I'm bringing this up because it's almost like a complete reversal of the older tradition of the democratic process, where we're supposed to be engaged citizens who are in active debate, that are engaged of the where, and we have like kind of direct participational government reality versus NPC status, where you are affirming the current problem or the current issue and positioning yourself to the certain policies that are prescribed to you and how you present yourself with that. I'm pointing out that's a tension that's showing up there. And it's because there's a kind of a fiction. There's a mythos that is being used for the democratic process. I'm saying this because I had a colleague of mine recently who kind of made an argument to me that, oh no, democracy is obviously going to survive. It's absolutely guaranteed. It's the end product of social organization. It's like you got fire, you got wheels, you got industrialization. It was inevitable through via process of development, we would get to democracy, and this is where we're ending up. And this is the completion. I'm very suspicious of, I have to be frank, I'm very suspicious of that, because that's a stance of almost unthinking. Because it's almost like, you're aware there are very specific political, social dynamics at play that allow that to happen. And when we've seen democracy be applied to other places that do not have that historical development, it has failed spectacularly, because it's very clear that there's certain norms and cultural expectations and fictions that have to be in play for democracy, democratic organization, to work in a way that's sustainable and effective. So I just get suspicious about that, especially when it's presented in an argumentation of, it outcompeted other modes of social organization. I don't know. I'm very nervous about that, because that's certainly true at a certain time frame, but that's part of that same mode of argument. Okay, new conditions can show up. And if we just unthink and just say, nope, we're not even going to consider other possibilities, I get very nervous about that. I think in particular, especially, I think of things like Brave New World, where it's almost like, what are the kind of unspoken protocols of a social organization? Because that's certainly, I kind of off the cuff riff on my part, is we've gone from explicit demarcations of the rule set to implicit rules demarcations of the rule set. And one of them tends to be kind of, and a more optimistic point of view from Javier's, what he said. I think we generally concluded that we're going to it's kind of Brave New World style, where we're going to let pleasure dictate how people are going to organize. Based on what your time preference of pleasure and how you orient to that, we're going to let society organize around those parameters. Now, for the few who actually choose pleasures that are not lower, narrow timeframes and usually have some utility function of value, we're going to allow them to enter the higher. We're going to do things like scholarships and other protocols to get them into a higher social status. That's just more, again, is this explicit? Is there anyone saying that explicitly? No, but that's just an implicit, it seems to be a rule set, but it has a relationship to kind of what we've decided. Is like, we're not going to coercively dictate people are certain statuses. Instead, we're going to just coordinate based on people's pleasures, of what they're going to orient around, what pleasures they're oriented against. And that will be the measure, as Plato says in Phaedrus, that you know a man by his pleasures, by what he loves. What love does he have that you know the man by that? So, and I want to close one last note, which is the idea of the social imagination, Daniel, which you pull up a lot. That thus this idea, like, what proposition we point out of the what if. So, for example, like actually a good example in terms of work is 4-Hour Work Week was a tour de force. Now, it was a fiction based on very particular protocols of currency and basically triaging, subterfuge triaging of currency rates, moving the dollar against other currencies, plus using online labor to delegate responsibilities. It's based on a lot of fictions, but my God, people love that narrative. People absolutely bit that up. And I think it is that question. Ironically, I find the kind of post-COVID environment of do we have to go to work every day? Can we allow for a 2-day, come to the office 2 days a week, 3 days a week protocol? I find that in the same vein of the 4-Hour Work Week. Like, it's in the same logic. So it's just basically that hypothesis was presented. It was wildly, people was crazy about it, sold like crazy. It was based on certain fiction, like certain protocols at a time that worked for certain people who could triage that and and win from that. But the larger implication of that line of thought led to things like the post-COVID online platform, like basically deworking phenomenon. We see in Europe some argumentation being made now for a 4-day work week, for example. Not only online, so we come to office 2 days a week, 3 days a week, but also 4 days a week workload. And I'm in the creative industry, so I see that already happening. All those trends are already happening in these intellectual markets already. Yeah, I think there was a lot being said, but actually, Daniel, one of those know, just the one last thing I thought I really appreciated was that note, that riff on the, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. It's a better statement. I love what you said. We don't learn from history. We had no choice. We have to repeat, because that's all we're just going to do what we know. And that leads to basically a mode of just taking, I think related to just not thinking is also doing we've just logically progressed to the endpoint, to the rational endpoint. There are no other protocols that are possible. And there's clearly no unspoken for affordances that allowed for this outcome to occur, that if they were not existent, we would not get the same outcome. So thus the kind of conditional standard of it. I really like that. I think that's actually quite powerful, because that gives, again, like I find like talking with you, Daniel, one of the justifications of history as a school of discipline, its importance in different aspects. This is just another example of that. If you don't have a good historical context and framework, you cannot answer the question of what other alternatives could we possibly do. Not even necessarily in just a pure mimicry mode, but even in a state of questioning, of just wearing of what were the conditionals that allowed for a certain outcome to happen. I think it's quite good. And that's all I got.
No, outstanding. For me, like the example you were just making of democracy, like when you read history, you realize, oh, things could be different. There's actually something about studying history that gives you agency. But then the question, this is the key, you have to also learn from history that it is not merely knowledge that helps you avoid history. It is some sort of creation of certain conditions that then change the social horizon. But this is the middle of the social. So you got the individual, the social, and the state, if I use the Juvenal-Bouvelli kind of distinction. History is really impacted by that middle. And we've lost the middle, and we don't think the middle, and we haven't had a social coordination system, but now we do. So we have to think that middle. It really matters. I think also, to your point on the democracy has won, it would be like saying that I'll just use the Christianity. It'd be like, well, Christianity's still here. Man, Christianity has changed so much, even though we still use that word, it's not clear what we're talking about, right? So sure, maybe democracy will always be with us, but it could just be the word, and basically something that has to pass as democracy will always be with us to get legitimacy. But the democracy of Tocqueville is very different from the democracy that we have in the United States at this point, right? Sure, same word, but it's very, very different. And I think that's, to me, a massive fallacy, even if it is the case that the word democracy will always be with us, because now it has the authority as the legitimization, like the rights of king did in the past. That's kind of the issue now, is democracy is functioning as a kind of legitimization of the system, like the rights of king, or the anointment or something like that, right? Okay, if you want to say to me democracy as anointing will always be with us, sure, but that there could be basically totalitarianism that could design itself in such a way that it passes as democracy, but it actually isn't, right? So saying democracy will always be with us doesn't tell us very much. It could just mean the word is always with us, which maybe we're worse off then, because that means we can't see the thing that's actually behind the word, right? And the same, like, again, like religions, like, yeah, same word, but what we're talking about today after American evangelicism, say the moral majority in the 70s, that is very different than like Protestantism. Like Christianity is so, like in America, means so many different things. That term, it doesn't tell us much to say will always be with us. The last thing I would say, and then I'll give it to Philip and then Jason, is that also this idea, just as a quick note, on this idea that the beautiful and the good, there's a kind of uselessness to it. Well, if we accept the basis of reality is creative and useless, is creativity useless? In a way, it kind of is. But then it generates the horizon of use, of things you can use, right? Like creativity is useless, and without it, there aren't things to use, right? So there's something very interesting. Likewise, if the human subjectivity has a certain sort of lack to it. Zizek will talk about the abyssal or some sort of incompleteness or some sort of creative process. Then to do things of which are ends in of themselves are kind of putting in the world something that is a testament to what the human is, a kind of useless thing. And the use of the useless thing is that it makes the world shine, if I use that kind of Hegelian language, right? There's a way in which the most important things have use with a dash through it because they shine. So is beauty useful? Well, it's useful with a dash through it. It's a kind of negation. The use is making everything shine. There's a shining to it that is observed that puts a dash through use that then sets the horizons of the world that things can be used in, but is not reducible to use. And that's what the human is, right? Like the human is a use with a dash to it. Yeah, you like the whole, like if you use human being, what's that called? Objectification, right? There's something that violates human shine and dignity if you use them, right? And yet humans are using entities. We use things. And in fact, we like to be useful. We like to be useful to the people around us. We like to do things that are useful and valuable to people, but it's a use with a dash through it. It's not a utilitarian use. It's a use that is always its own negation, and that's why it shines. And I think the same thing happens for things like beauty, truth, and goodness. These things that really matter is that there's a use with a dash through it. And that doesn't say that useful things are bad, but it sets the horizon of what it is all toward. And that negation then is an opening of a lack to make something absent and present at the same time that is most optimal, and also would then be analogous to what is most fundamental if non-locality is fundamental, like Stuart Kaufman. That would actually be fitting for the origin of things in alignment. But anyway, let me give it to Philip, Jason, and then Javier. Philip, please.
Well, it's a perfect argument for one human being having 640 or $750 billion. Like everyone knows it's useless. That person couldn't spend that money in 100 lifetimes. That's where it gets. It's to be engaging in certain types of games. This is where in Deleuze talking about being tired of trees, right? So like, what's the difference between profit and profiteering? Generally, it's just one person's upset that someone else got a lot more than they did. Like, well, that person's clearly a profiteer. The people don't want that, and all they're over there saying, no, the market is demanding this, and the market, it tells the truth. It tells the truth of what people actually want. People say they want, healthy food, but if you invest in McDonald's, like you might get a return on your investment, and that has real world correlates. One of the like interesting things going on with language, you have the Wille zu Kraft versus the Wille zu Macht. It's like very similar words in German, but anyone who reads the German would know that the Kraft is like raw power. This is what Manchester, had the Nazis appropriate, whereas Macht is much more like the ability to command and obey. That's the important part about the will to power. The ability to obey is also the will to power. Nietzsche is against the initial move being a negation. His idea is if the first move is a negation, you're a reactionary. He is this pure, as pure as can be, but it would be like pure post otium et bellum, right? That's like the most important thing for him. He's like, the first thing you have to do is you have to go to war so that you can have free time. Like, you got to kill a bunch of other people and conquer their land so that you don't have to work. Once you've done that, you affirm all your values, and then what happens is the next people come along, they have to take on all of your values before they change anything. And And what's going to happen is you're just going to have a lot of people. I mean, it would be the difference. It would, like, the Lotus example is against the backdrop. I don't know. Some people might call it like a meaning crisis. Some people might call it like a mental health crisis. Some people might call it like an attention crisis. That's the backdrop. Is it? I don't know who, but apparently there are people in our world who have difficulty sitting alone with their thoughts for, I don't know, more than an hour or so. This would be something for them to react against, right? So they go, I seem to like be having trouble building skills, because it seems like the people who are able to build skills are able to pay attention to the thing that they're doing slightly longer than I am. Maybe I should tell a story of resentment, you know, of like why those people were born with a better hand than me. And then I can use that to fuel the meaninglessness of my existence. And I feel like this is where Nietzsche would come in and say, that is weak. Like that is a reaction to, rather than a transcendence of the given conditions. You have to go, like you're saying, Dan, you have to go and like start thinking, how can I set my own conditions of possibility, knowing that there's no like ultimate total power that can be won, but some relative relational. And then there was something way back in the conversation about that had me thinking just about creativity. I saw this Winnicott quote about like the creative is one who fights against the tension of communicating and hiding. Like combined with like Nick Land's quote on artists as being those savage beasts who can't get enough of too much. And then thinking kind of about like the balance between eros and agape. So you have the eros affirming the individual personality, and then the surrender to whatever you want to call it, absolute spirit, life force, etc. And like how those two can allow the human being to turn their soul into a work of art.
No, very well put. I'll give it to Jason and Javier. What I'll say, for me, a negation without a sublation is an effacement, is the language that, and what Nietzsche, most of the time, negations are actually effacements. They're not sublative. And the funny thing that I would say that's very large, and I'd have to justify it, is that history is a test of what negations are sublations, not just effacements, and we don't know till we try. And then once we try, and like the fear of error is the fear of truth. So yeah, it was reasonable to think that getting $200 billion would be the right time of useless. And then it turns out everyone becomes going to certain islands and kind of weird and wacky, right? That it doesn't seem to work, right? But we had to go through the period of trying it, actually, because that's the saturation point, right? There was reason to think that having no job and nothing to do, and you know, that would be the useless. No, that's boredom, right? But this is the funny thing. For me, history is more so a test of what negations are sublations than it is what positive programs work, right? Because the emphasis on the negation then has a certain humility that opens up things for a sublative possibility that is not reducible to agency, but it also means that you have to, you can't just negate. It's the David Hume thing where you have to ascend, but then there's a certain arrogance of ascending. We're not that has to return to common life. It has to break. You know, you could even say agency, lose agency, return to agency. There's all these different moves. There's a return that is kind of for Hegel, the RE in parentheses, the sublation, and history, but we don't know which returns are actually sublative versus simply effacements, right? That's why we have to go through a historical process to learn. But here's the weird thing. This is why it's a mixture of agency and determinism. You have to go through the process to experiment, but then learning the results of the experiment are not given. The agency, like you had to go through the process to find out what didn't work, but then the fact that you find out what didn't work and act on it, that's up to you, right? And so that's to me the weird thing, and that's of course very Hegelian, where you had to go through history, very deterministic in a way, so that you had a chance to decide how you're going to respond. Okay, this useless that you thought was going to be the one with the slash to its sublative turned out to simply be effacement. What you going to do? What you going to do? Give up hope or try to make a new social coordination system, et cetera, so forth, right? So I think it's an excellent point on the $1 billion, but that's exactly right. Let me give it to Jason and Javier. Jason, please. Wonderful to have you, sir.
Wonderful to be here. That reminds me of an illustration. I don't know where I got this from, but one of the Hegel secondary texts. But the idea is that it's the difference between learning how to swim theoretically and then swimming in the pool and then learning how to swim there, right? So these are the two different senses of learning, but one is more, yeah, as you said, you got to try it, right? And I think that's basically the historical process we have to go through, right? It's not a continuous kind of train of rationality. I've been reading Lessing's The Education of Human Race, and in there there's this problem. Let's say God revealed to us some knowledge in the beginning. Would that be good, actually? If God revealed everything to us all at the start, would that be good? And paradoxically, that would actually lead to like God being jealous and God being whatever, right? Because the example the way he explained it is very interesting to me. If a person promises something to you and you know this person will never break it, right? This person is perfect in every way. In what sense are you learning anything, right? You're just following the commands, so to speak, And this becomes like a very primordial or childish way of thinking where we don't rise from the logic of reward and punishment, right? So the way this education is done, I think this is something Javier brought up, there's certain hints in life, right? There are hints and allusions, and we see this in like, certain passages in the Bible that may not mean anything, or any holy text or any whatever, right? These are basically just hints to make us curious about deeper things. But these are perhaps the what he called the positive kind of aspect of perfection, right? The way to perfection. These are the negative aspect is, I think, very interesting, which is to say you give it the hints, you give it the illusions, but the point is you have to keep the way towards the truth open. You have to give hints and illusion in such a way that keeps the path forwards open. So in the same way that a student, for example, in primary school, you're given knowledge, right? But just partial knowledge. But not saying that this is the truth, is the only truth, but that you just basically omit the rest of the knowledge, but in such a way that you can theoretically go through it yourself, And another path to perfection is this kind of, you encounter a kind of tautological knowledge, right? So this is, we mentioned earlier, humanity is bad, humanity is good. But we can say both of these things at once, right? Humanity is bad is true if you just look at it. But humanity is good is true also in the sense that I can just prove I'll give you something, or both senses can be true. And this kind of tautology, I think, this kind of like repetition makes us consider a kind of unity that does not exclude a kind of plurality. So it means that humanity isn't just inherently good. The point is that we're not just totally good or totally bad, but it includes within us this this openness, right? This capacity to become, I don't know, right? But nonetheless, this kind of tautological thinking is a window, as you said, Daniel. I think it sets the horizon to perfection. It kind of makes us think. It makes you think, right? And yeah, so I think there is something important about living with partial knowledge and living with a kind of basically, I think, how to transcend the logic of reward and punishment. It's like we can't. Yeah, I think, of course, pleasure can show us various things, but I think at the end of the day, what's important is that we realize that there is something potential within us that isn't actualized, and that's a problem for us, right? In any way, and this is the ground level problem that I think we have to solve, for us to be free. I'll stop right there. Thank you so much.
No, outstanding. I'll give it to Javier, and then alas, I will have to go. So this has been well. There's a few things that come to mind. There's this weird thing in Genesis, as an example, where Adam is made like God, but then the temptation is you'll be like God, right? So they're being tempted with something they already have. We've talked about that before. Well, the only way that temptation could work is if Adam didn't feel like God, right? The weird thing is we seemingly don't feel like we're in paradise unless we go through partiality, struggle, and difficulty, right? There's a way in which it's only in, say, a New Jerusalem, which is a chosen Eden, an earned Eden, that you can be like God and feel like God. Therefore, it actually feels like paradise in a way, right? And you kind of see this. Like, if you get all the old guys who are on the football team, they can sit around a table and just have the greatest time, right? Like, they don't need anything. They don't need to consume. Just telling stories or just knowing that we all went on the battlefield together creates a certain intimacy, a certain connection that is not possible without that, right? And that's all thanks to partiality and imperfection, that kind of camaraderie, right? There's a sense, perhaps, in which Eden couldn't consist of the old guys from the football team sitting around having a good time, and they could sit there for hours, like eternity. That's not possible until after, free choice and difficulty in New Jerusalem, right? And it does seem to be that sharing of doing something hard together is at the heart of the greatest intimacies. Like, not just consuming together, but doing something not given, not automatic. That seems to be what creates an intimacy that's not possible otherwise. And in a way, could God be God if he denied that of us? Maybe that's what like Satan would do to us, right? Deny us the possibility of that kind of intimacy to be provocative. So I think what you're getting at is very powerful and very true. And I think that just goes to be with human beings, right? Like that is a testament to the glory of agency per se, but it has to be scarred. But let me give it to Javier and then close this. Forgive me for having to go. The tyranny of work. But Javier Rivera.
Yeah, so what's interesting to add on to the psychoanalytic idea of pleasure is that there is just as much ambiguity in pursuing one's pleasure as the discrepancy or drawing the line between what is displeasurable. So, for example, the idea of surplus pleasure in psychoanalysis is that even in the pursuit of something, you can enjoy its denial. You can enjoy the discipline of the denial. So that means fasting can be deeply not fun, but it can become something that you enjoy the denial in that kind of displeasure. And so what's interesting about this is that what it shows is that whenever what it shows about surplus pleasure is that surplus pleasure always says, not only do you aim to enjoy, but there's always a question at the end of your enjoyment, which is, what do I enjoy more? Which is precisely the opening in the experiments of living that we are afraid to entertain, but it's already within the libido. for Freud. It's already within the libido. And so, Daniel, when you gave the example of like, you know, we could be suffering, but that there can be like a kind of enjoyment in the camaraderie of the togetherness. That's something that I didn't even know that I could enjoy until I was in the army, right? Like everything sucked, but it was pretty good if I was with my friends, you know, like it was pretty good if we sucked together, you know? And that's something I didn't know that I enjoyed. So I think sometimes when it comes down, what's always very interesting, and this could be a very, I'm playing on the double-sidedness of pleasure here and the idea of uncomfortability, because there's a certain point when uncomfortability can be a point of pleasure, right? You've been doing this for a while. It becomes rote for you. It becomes a source of pleasure, right? What's really interesting is that when you change up the rote, when you promote another experience, another experimentation to practice, what ends up happening is at first you are not enjoying it, but then pleasure soon wants to take over because it starts to become rote and enjoys it, right? And what's very fascinating about this is that what is displeasurable is the very opening to say, is there something else you could enjoy more? That's another way to look at it. Is there something else that you could enjoy more, that you're actually denying yourself because it initially is undesirable? It is not desirable. It is, and so on. So there's like a really funny dynamic with the fact that pleasure not only can captivate us in the roteness of things, but pleasure is also the thing, because of its relation to displeasure, it's also the very thing that can provoke, is there something that you enjoy more? And it's only until we engage into the things that are make us uncomfortable that we begin to explore what could make us enjoy more. What is there something that I couldn't find enjoyment in? And this is a really interesting, this allows for very interesting pivots, because then you can never get stuck in a kind of like certain framework, because the question of pleasure is always going to be, what do you enjoy more? Well, no Facebook. Oh, and just elaborate on this. I was thinking about pessimism here as a kind of negation, whether it could be a sublation or just an effacement. And what's really interesting about this is that, well, if life has been torturing you because it's so filled with meaning, but you can't find it, then the sublation part might actually be accepting that there is no meaning, that life is pointless. And that would be the sublation element for you. Because a life filled with meaning to which you cannot find would be an utter effacement for the individual. However, what's interesting about that is at the moment you become what I noticed about pessimism as I was gauging more and more into it, was it started to become less and less interesting. Why? Because it's always about suffering. It's always about what we're doing is just the same thing over and over. What we're doing is just, we're just animals. We're just making sounds. There's no meaning. We're just going to die. It's very uninteresting. It becomes uninteresting because I've already accepted the sublated point of like, okay, so there's no meaning. Now what? Now I'm interested in other avenues of thought, knowing that if everything is meaningless, it's fine. But the pessimistic position from then on is very uninteresting. It gathers nothing for you, and it doesn't provoke any experiments. At that point, I would say, if you accept the pessimistic position as the sublated point, then it can be the opening point for you just to do experiments in living. Because then it's just in the background of things, like, okay, there's no meaning, and so on. Okay, well then, if there's no meaning, then you don't have to live life like a automaton. You can just engage in other things. So it's really interesting that there's different pivot points on whether something could be sublative for an individual or a kind of effacement. And I think the meaning crisis, ironically, would take more of a sublative point if they took a pessimistic position and then did experiments in living. Because the idea is like, oh my God, I can't find my meaning. I can't find my meaning. What is my meaning? What is the point of my life? Once we forget ourselves, and I think pessimistic position is a way to forget yourself. It kind of provokes that forgetting of yourself because it deconstructs everything that you are obsessed about. It can be that point. But yeah, I'll stop there.
The problem is, like, you start with meaning, then you say there is no, like, nothing matters, but then nothing matters and everything is nothing. That's the sublation. That's the Humean arc. One of the problems is people haven't been nihilistic enough because they actually find enjoyment from saying nothing matters, right? They don't really take it seriously. Once you take it seriously, well, then nothing matters, everything's nothing, therefore it matters, right? But the funny thing is, the key there is arriving at the point where nothing equals matters. And you decide if that is an effacement or a negation. That's where the choice and agency comes out. Once you get to the place, and this applies to history as a whole, you need history to get to the place where you get something like a Schrodinger's cat, a bothness, a duck bunny, that you choose if it's a duck bunny. We're at the moment, you got to get to the moment where nothing equals matters. Okay, so now choose. You know, does that mean nothing matters, therefore it matters or not? You need to get to that point of the absolute choice. Mr. Jockin.
I know you got to run, but just on that, I just want to bring up the note about the origin is good. Basically, just the highest levels of virtue are related to the origin is good from Aquinas. So that sense of friendship is correlated around the organization of a seeking of a origin is good together. And I say this because things like even beauty is said to be difficult, as from Plato, from Greater Hippias. So this idea of coordination through some kind of originousness that gives us a context of pain. That's the reason why even like the argument's always been made is like, how can thieves have friendship if they're doing something that's illicit? Part of the answer, that's part of the answer, is that but it's in an effacement mode because it's basically incomplete, but it's still enough of a coordination activity to give modes of friendship or relationship with each other. Usually correlated around some perceived good that is outside the subject, which leads to the last note. One mode of self-forgetting is beyond even the question of kind of narrative structure of meaning of my life. Is ironically when you turn that your brain off, that part of your brain off, and go, how can I serve someone else? It tends to obliterate. Meaning never goes away once you do that. Again, it's when we talk about beauty as well. This kind of interpenetrative state is when the subject of meaning is meant to be isolated and about oneself only. The only answer is nothing. Is absolute nothing. That is the answer. But when it goes to the other and moves to otherness and other modes of friendship or beauty, etc., that tends to transform and change and never be an issue once that happens. Great conversation. Really enjoyed it.
No, I'll give it to Philip. I mean, another reason why you have to get at that equal sign is because Leibniz tells us there is no equal sign. So there's an instability that you're forced to resolve one way or the other, and you have to choose, right? Agency emerges when you arrive at the duck bunnies. And I know that's from a net conversation, maybe 60, like the Wittgenstein, it looks like a duck and a bunny at the same time. You can equally go one way or the other. Causation, it's a creative act. You choose then, but you have to arrive at that. History has to arrive at that. You have to take nihilism enough to arrive at that. And it's in arriving at that moment that these few moments of agency in your life that make a huge difference all around arise as you make a choice there. History is about arriving at duck bunnies. So is individual life. But Philip, please.
No, I'm just saying that seems to be what could get what Jason was talking about with beyond punishment and reward, as far as like first recognizing that we are the writers and the directors of our inner psychological drama, that the way out is either everything is meaningless, everything is a miracle, everything is a meaningless miracle, fine, but like, you know, chocolate ice cream is a miracle and strawberry is meaningless. That's where you get into all sorts of fun trouble. I won't hold you hostage here, Daniel, even though that's such a fun thing to do. Have fun at work.
I love you, Philip. No, I think that's brilliant. Well, it brings to mind, and then I will just very quickly, there's that funny notion of, you know, God uses evil for its own destruction, like Christianity, the cross is its glory. Likewise, the great victory of nihilism is precisely its undermining, right? Like the moment where it equals, then it's like, well, okay, nothing matters, everything's nothing, so everything matters. And that undermining, and that looks at Dante and the great reversals, like that, like that's always like there's a real way in which goodness needs evil to undermine itself to truly prove that it's good. Because if goodness destroys evil, you could always say, well, maybe goodness was just more powerful than evil, and actually evil was better, but it wasn't given the chance, right? So there's almost a way in which a theological logic would be like, goodness is like, no, watch, it is fundamentally auto-cannibalistic in of its own right, right? And that's almost where glory has to be. The last thing I'll say that I was thinking about, the enjoyment of suffering. The problem with capitalism, if we use this Lacanian notion, is that our suffering is individuated, and we enjoy the suffering as an individual, which means we enjoy suffering at the expense of others, and we enjoy it in a way that isolates us. The right thing is that humans need to enjoy suffering in a community. That's actually most fitting for human beings. And the reason why that's also very important is because there is a certain equality that emerges that is not this lame equality that's poured in from the top. We're all denied the object. We all suffer together. You're white, I'm black, you're rich, you're poor, you're man, you're woman, and we were all denied the object. And isn't that amazing? Like there's a certain equality and freedom and justice that also moves from desire to drive, right? Because we are driven to be together and we have a drive dwelling with one another. You could say one of the great problems with the world today is it has denied us communal enjoyment of suffering, individuated, which is more of a problem than individual consumption. There's such an emphasis on the individual consuming and not destroying everything. It's more so the individual comes to enjoy suffering alone at the expense of others to themselves. That's when you get all of these pathologies. That, that innate tendency, if you will, spirituality, but not, that's very good. That is meant for others, for being toward other, for other. The enjoyment of suffering that is found in psychoanalysis is supposed to be the state of being for otherness that creates that enjoyment of the football team. But under an atomistic, individuated logic in a world that lacks social coordination systems, we cannot socially coordinate a shared enjoyment of suffering that looks like a community in that very deep and profound way. I must run. I am so sorry. It's good to see you all. All the best. All you bet.